Oh my goodness, how exciting. This is so exciting. I'm filled with joy to be here. So my children, so I have 3 boys. I'm one of 4 girls, but I have 3 boys. And my oldest is a freshman in college. I have a senior in high school, and I have an 8th grader, both of whom are graduating this week. In fact, the prom was last night and the 8th grade graduation. So it's been a very busy, busy week. But I've been thinking a lot about my own path in the world that brought me to the moment that I'm at now, where I have this book that has done well and has been exciting to talk about. For a year, I've been talking about this book, and I kind of never get sick of it because, as you'll see in a moment, it's really, the subject matter is exciting. But I realized that, we all tell narratives, we tell stories about our lives, and the story that I've always told is that, I had some lucky breaks along the way. I became a writer because I sort of fell into it. But as my boys get older and I start seeing that they're making their own choices as they go, I realize that it's a lot more complicated than that. So I wanted to share with you, just for a moment, what I think I have done without necessarily being able to articulate it until just now, when I had to for my boys, who were kind of asking, well, how did you get started with this, and how did you get started with that? And I think ultimately what it comes down to for me is that I have tended to follow the yes. There have been lots of times that people have said no to me. Many, many times. Many rejections, many doors shut in my face, unanswered letters, emails, et cetera, et cetera. And somehow the lone voice saying, you can do it, you can continue, you can move forward, is the voice that I tended to listen to. And I'm not sure what it is in my character that did that, except that I was sort of scrappy and tenacious. I grew up in a family without a lot of money, and I was the oldest of 4 girls. I was taking care of my younger sisters from a very young age, and I think I was just determined to follow the yes, to listen to the voices telling me that I could succeed. And that is the way I think that I created whatever luck I've had, simply by tuning out as many as possible of the voices that were saying I couldn't succeed, and giving a lot of power to those few voices that said I could. And so I would urge you to do that, to understand that life, particularly if you're a writer, but everyone's life, is filled with disappointment and rejection and people who tell you that you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not strong enough, you're not going to be able to do whatever it is you want to do. And it's a matter of pushing past those, in my own experience, and really clinging to the ones who believe in you. So, now the other thing I wanted to say is that, as you'll see in a moment, one of the greatest experiences that I've had from doing this book is learning that stories have power. How much power stories have. The activist Janet Mock says, I believe that telling our stories, first to ourselves and then to one another and the world, is a revolutionary act. And I completely agree. So I'm going to tell you how this all started. It's going to be a very quick little presentation, but I want you to get a glimpse of the kind of world that I fell into and what I learned from these girls and women that you're about to see. But first, here's my son Hayden. He's 8 years old in this photograph. He's my college freshman. He's 19 now, so this was 11 years ago. We were visiting my in-laws in Fargo, North Dakota, at the holidays. And of course, if you've ever been to Fargo, you know there was a blizzard, at Christmas time. Hayden is a bit quirky, and he was, unlike his younger brothers who were running around screaming, he was sitting in a corner leafing through a book. This book. It's an odd book for an 8-year-old to be looking at, but it's called Century of Stories. It's a centennial celebration of the small town of Jamestown, North Dakota, where my mother-in-law is from, and where she lived her whole life until she went to college at 18. So she came over, and they were looking through it together, and this, as I say, this was 11 years ago. She hadn't really looked through it. She'd sort of leafed through it. But they stumbled on this article. They called it Orphan Train, and it proved there was a home for many children on the prairie. Now, Carol, my mother-in-law, had lived in this town, as I told you, her whole life until she was 18, and she'd never even heard of the orphan trains. But the orphan trains carried 250,000 children over a 75-year period from New York, mostly, Grand Central, to the Midwest in a work program, a labor program. The children were 2 to 14 years old, and they were indentured. And most people don't know anything about it. But not only that, this is her father and his brother and their 3 sisters. They were all on a train, and none of them had ever mentioned it. So I knew when I heard this story that this was huge. It's a story, a really important story about American history that's been hidden in plain sight. But I was terrified at the idea of even pretending to think I knew enough to take it on. So over the next 7 years, I was working on 2 other novels and a nonfiction book, but I was sort of also gathering my courage, I think. You know, I'm not descended from a train rider. I didn't feel like I had a right to the material. I didn't feel like I knew enough about it. So I started to learn. I had a Google alert for Orphan Train. I flew to Ireland and did research. I flew to the Midwest. I interviewed 7 living train riders. And about 3.5 years ago, I started working on this book. And so I guess that's my next point to you is do the scary thing. Do the scary thing. Seize the story. Tell the story that you're afraid to tell, that makes you scared that you don't know enough about it or you can't articulate it or you don't have the tools, because that's the powerful story. There's a wonderful line actually from Shailene Woodley, who isn't the star of The Fault in Our Stars. I don't know if you all have seen that. I saw that with my 14-year-old son, and the sobbing in the theater was so loud, we could barely hear the movie. But anyway, she said, the second you get out of your head and into your heart, you can be present for other people. And there's something about that in writing as well. And in this story, I was able to kind of get into my own heart, my own feeling of being a girl who had grown up actually doing a lot of work in the family and without a lot of money, as I said. And the parts of the Orphan Train story that I could relate to, I really did work into the story. Okay, so we are in Lower Manhattan, which is where this photo was taken, at about the time that my story takes place. This is Elizabeth Street. And at the time that I write about, which is the 1920s, the Irish were so terribly discriminated against that they often couldn't even get jobs. So as I began working on my story, I'm part Irish, and I realized that that was something I could tap into. I wanted to write about people who had been discriminated against and what that felt like. So that was part of my impetus. See the second one, Wanted, a girl of neat and industrious habits and amiable disposition to take entire charge of 2 small children. No Irish need apply. Here are children, archival photos of children on the streets of New York. There were 30,000 children living on the streets. You know, homelessness is a problem now, but at least we have shelters and social programs. There were no social programs, there was no welfare, no foster care, no child labor laws, no child welfare laws. Children were property, and poor children, pure and simple, were labor. This little girl is taking care of her sister, and this photo was one that, you know, as I know a lot of you are writers, and maybe you do the same thing. I always have a bulletin board where I tack ideas and inspiration and postcards, and this photo was tacked to my bulletin board because she's sort of a model for my character of Molly, who's 9 years old. Of Neve, who's 9 years old when the story starts. This little boy is a bootblack. And when you read my book, you'll see that he's kind of a model for the character of Dutchie, who's a boy who goes on the orphan train with Neve. I love this photo because don't these children look like they're about 40 years old? Selling newspapers. Children on the streets slept wherever they could. They slept on fire escapes. They slept on grates. This is a group of orphan train riders. So the guy who came up with the idea really had a positive impulse. He wanted to send children, they were dying of disease, of being run over, of starvation. And by the way, orphan train is a misnomer. Only about 30% of the children were orphaned. The rest were abandoned, they were taken out of homes, they were runaways, and they were literally plucked off the streets. Parents would tell their children not to go out after 6 p.m. because the police might take them away and put them on a train. This is a collection of the children. This is a particularly large group of train riders. This is more representative. I found this photo recently. This is a train load of children in North Dakota. So what would happen is that they would get off the train, line up by height, and then they would get randomly plucked out of the lineup. Trains of all boys were by far the most popular because, of course, they could work in the field, 9 to 14-year-old boys. And as the National Orphan Train Complex says, we had just gone through a civil war to abolish slavery, but the farms and shops still needed labor. Some of these children took the place of slaves. They were indentured or contracted. Adoption was not required. A family did not have to pay more than room and board. There were really no protections built into this program. Isn't it amazing that we don't know about this? So this is an actual certificate of indenture. This child was indentured to the age of 21 to a farmer. So essentially it's labor till you're 21. Trains of all babies were called mercy trains. Babies were the second most popular group. So by far the least popular group, adolescent girls. Here's what this girl in the black outfit has to say about this photograph. She's 11 years old, Alice Eiler, and she was among the last children to ride on the train, so at the same time that my character rides. She and her mother and siblings lived in a tent in upstate New York, surviving on green water and berries. She was orphaned at 9 and moved from family to family. She says, a hired hand without pay. I was told constantly that I had bad blood. I was always looking at my veins and wondering what could be bad about it. It looked just like everyone else's. So I knew then, once I was reading about the trains and about the fact that girls were had such a difficult time of it, that I wanted to write about a girl. So my main character, is a 9-year-old girl. And in fact, this picture was also on my bulletin board because my character becomes a seamstress. And the expression in the eyes of this little girl I find particularly haunting. Here's a picture of the children lining up by height. This is a typical poster, and I'll just read you quickly. So a company of homeless children will arrive, having been thrown friendless upon the world, which I find such a poignant phrase. Homes are wanted with farmers, being mostly of respectable parentage. They are desirable children and worthy of good homes. And they may be taken on trial. The indenture provides for 4 months of schooling. In fact, the train riders ended up going all over the United States. People would take them all over the place. So as you can see, they went to almost every state in the nation, including slaveholding states. So I'm kind of going to end by just telling you this last story about my inspiration. So as I mentioned, the Irish were discriminated against terribly, but it was much worse to be a redhead. Much worse. So here's an article from the New York Times in 1901. Foundlings find homes, children from an asylum taken west, no redheads among them. So 52 black, brown, yellow, and flaxen-haired children fill a special car. No redheads or children with freckles are among them. Redheads, especially those with freckles, are not easily placed in homes, even if their hair is of Titian and their freckles beauty spots. So they ask the traveling agent why, and he says he's asked all over the United States and has invariably been told that redheaded children fought too much and have bad tempers generally. He does not understand this. He does not agree with this verdict, but finds it difficult to defeat a tradition that has stood for many generations. Now, here are my 2 oldest children. So as you can see, I had quite a personal incentive for making my character a redhead. And some of the stuff that my children talked about over the years these are jokes now, but this stuff was real. And redheads were actually banned from the trains for a decade because they were so unwanted that they would get on the train at Grand Central and make the whole route and come back. So anyway, my point is, like you girls who are going to be reading your stories, I too drew on my own life as I was working on this book. And I do think that the power of telling our stories, whether we're writing novels or writing nonfiction, is what propels really interesting writing. And even though mine was transmuted into a whole different story, as I was preparing for today, I was realizing how deep the roots go in terms of my own interest in this topic. So just to end, this is me with some train riders, wonderful women who I met and interviewed at a reunion in Little Falls, Minnesota. And this is the logo of the New York Train Riders Association. So I think I just want to end by saying that I was doing an event, and a man came up who had been a train rider, and he said, I think there's something special about the train riders because we're survivors. We're scrappy, tenacious. We reinvented ourselves. And as I was thinking about talking to you all today, I realized that his words are also important for us to remember as writers. That being scrappy and tenacious and willing to reinvent yourself as you go is part of the secret, I believe, to having a long and fulfilling life where you do the things that you love. So thank you all for having me.